Double standards over civilian deaths and outright denial of any responsibility. The US and Russia have traded blame for killing innocent people. But can any state be held accountable for killing civilians? This is Inside Story. Hello and a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Whether in Syria, Afghanistan or Yemen, civilians are always the first casualties of war. And governments have become very skilled at shifting blame and responsibility. In Syria, where a host of different countries with different agendas are militarily involved, the high civilian death rate has fueled an unprecedented refugee crisis. Since joining the war, Russia has come under sustained attack from the US, the UK and others who say Russian airstrikes may have killed hundreds of civilians already and also risk fueling more violence and radicalization. But of course, it's not just Russia. The US was criticized earlier this month when its troops bombed an Afghan hospital run by Doctors Without Borders, killing 22 patients and doctors. And for years, the US has been conducting a covert drone war that is estimated to have killed thousands of civilians. So are governments held accountable for killing non-combatants, and are some civilian casualties the inevitable outcome of keeping people safe? Let's bring in our guest straight away in New York, Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of a publication called The Intercept and author of The Drone Wars, a piece that examines the effect of warfare on civilians' lives in Beirut. Nadim Houry, Human Rights Watch Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa. And in Oxford, Tom Simpson, an Associate Professor at the University of Oxford. He researches military ethics. I'm going to put this question to all three of you, starting with you, Tom Simpson. Can any of these world powers, these perpetrators of conducting this violence, be held responsible for killing so many innocent people?
Well, thank you, Jane. And I think the first thing to say is every civilian death is an absolute tragedy. And anyone who denies that is clearly stepping beyond the moral pale. And that's clearly not the case for the UK, it's not the case for the US. I've served in uniform myself, and that was absolutely not. And there was never anything other than that recognition that was right at the forefront for our operations. I think the tragedy is that there is, we've got people in the world today who are not committed to the rule of law and are willing to take some pretty bloody measures to bring about a particular political vision that they hold. And the use of force, tragically, always does end up with people dying, innocent people dying, not just those engaged in the combat. And I suppose there's two things that are really important. So the first is to make sure that the target of military operations are combatants. So any civilian casualties are only ever the unintended consequence of military operations. And secondly, that's proportional. So not only must the target be military, but there must be very, very few civilians who suffer as a result of those military operations. And I think just if we could go to the drone wars, the drone papers specifically, that Jeremy, it's actually a very helpful highlight to discussion that he's brought. And one of the points that he makes there, which I think is absolutely right, is that Obama has this criterion, President Obama, of near certainty of no civilian casualties for a legitimate drone strike. And insofar as there's evidence that the drone program has not been carried out compatibly with that criterion, President Obama himself should be leading calls to investigate why the processes that the US operates do not abide to that. So it's absolutely critical that these great powers internationally are held to account for that. If I can just add a note of realism, I'm afraid. The nature of international politics is such that the prospect of an international body holding great powers, the UN Security Council and so forth, to account is slim. And what we require is those powers to hold themselves to account. And we do, fortunately, I speak from sitting in the UK as I do here. And that is a position that the UK government is formally committed to, and it's absolutely right that people hold the government to account to its set standards.
That seems to be key, though, doesn't it? Holding themselves
should not be underestimated.
To account. I mean, you raised many points there, Tom Simpson. I'm going to throw this to you, Jeremy Scahill, and we will go into drones in more detail. But just on the topic of holding these perpetrators, these governments accountable, how do you do it?
I mean, first of all, the United States, under both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, has systematically blocked any attempt to hold the U.S. and its allies to account under international law. The United States wants an international criminal court for countries like those of the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda, but when it comes to actually holding U.S. personnel responsible for potential war crimes, some U.S. lawmakers have gone so far as to say that they would propose legislation to invade The Hague to liberate any U.S. personnel brought up on war crimes charges. The second is that the United States always tries to portray itself as sort of different than the rest of the world because, we don't mean to be killing civilians. I think that's somewhat of a dubious claim. The United States has intentionally targeted television stations, journalists. They've hit Red Cross facilities. This recent episode of the hospital of Médecins Sans Frontières that was bombed, evidence is emerging this week that seems to indicate that, in fact, it was a deliberate strike and that they were supposedly going after someone who was a Taliban figure. I think that we often try to say, well, because we don't speak in the language of savagery like our opponents, and we're not gratuitous in the way that the Taliban or Al-Qaeda are in their direct targeting of civilians, that somehow it makes our bombings more humanitarian. The reality is that the first airstrike that President Obama authorized in Yemen of his presidency in December of 2009 killed 41 people in Al-Majala with cluster bombs, which most countries in the world believe should be banned. They're like flying landmines. And almost a majority of the people killed in that strike were women and children and had nothing to do whatsoever with Al-Qaeda. So to me, the issue of accountability is one that is dripping in hypocrisy. I think that Vladimir Putin's forces are committing war crimes. I think that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. I think they should be brought to account. But if Bashar al-Assad is going to go to prison for his war crimes, he should be down the hall in the cell block from Donald Rumsfeld.
What are your thoughts, Nadim Houry? And you do wonder how you can police the world when you are also partaking in these atrocities.
Sure. I think international law is very clear, and it puts the onus on countries to investigate themselves. Unfortunately, countries don't like to investigate themselves, either democracies like the US or despotic autocracies. I think the challenge here is, can there be enough public pressure through access to information, such as the reporting that Jeremy has done, through the work of human rights groups, to create enough of a momentum to push for independent, non-partisan investigations. And once these investigations are launched, that they actually get to a result. That is still the most likely scenario, and we have to create enough pressure in the US to finally get an independent investigation into these drone strikes. In addition, when countries are not willing to investigate themselves, which is unfortunately the case of most countries, we have to build up the institution of international justice. It's still very slow, it's still very imperfect, and frankly very frustrating. But that is the only way to do it. And I think the only tool we have to push for that is information, is to reveal what are the policies behind these strikes, and to actually investigate and to remind people that drone strikes or some of the airstrikes by US or Russia in Syria or Iraq, they seem very far. They always present them as very surgical, very clean. And when you go and investigate them, it turns out very often that it's not. And we have to show that evidence to actually remind them of the need to investigate.
Okay, Jeremy, maybe you can talk us through what the policies are.
Can I just say one specific?
Sure, and then I'd like to know from you what the policies are that justify certain types of killings.
One of the things that the documents that we obtained from a whistleblower, which are secret and top secret documents pertaining to the U.S. military's drone program. The CIA and the military have parallel drone programs. Even less is known about the CIA program than the military now that we have put these out in the public domain. But in one instance, in a campaign inside of Afghanistan, a high-value targeting campaign, in other words, an assassination campaign aimed at taking out figures that are affiliated with al-Qaeda or are organizing attacks against U.S. troops, what the documents show, and this is the Pentagon's own data, was that in one 5-month period in Afghanistan, 88% of the people that were killed in these so-called targeted strikes, mostly by drones, were not the intended target. We don't know, and the military doesn't know, who these people were. Now, it's totally possible that many of those people were Taliban or al-Qaeda. It's also possible that they were innocent civilians. What our documents show is that oftentimes drone pilots are effectively firing blind, not that they can't see images on their camera, but that they're basing their targeting of people not on knowing that the individual that they want to kill is there, but on his metadata or his cell phone or signals intelligence provided by a foreign power like Saudi Arabia, which of course has its own agenda. So I think in all, what our documents show is that the U.S. drone program is relying on less than ideal intelligence to make very lethal decisions about who's going to live and who's going to die. Tom is right when he talks about the standards that President Obama has implemented. One of our documents shows the chain of command for authorizing lethal drone strikes intended to assassinate so-called high-value targets. And what you see is a very labyrinthine bureaucracy that has the President of the United States sitting atop of this, what amounts to a parallel justice system that has actually nothing to do with the courts, where the President and his top advisors and military commanders debate individuals to be put on the kill list, and they put together what they call targeting packages known as baseball cards that essentially have the statistics of an individual that the military or others in the intelligence community are proposing for being taken out in a drone strike. The president then reviews it, and on average it takes 58 days for President Obama to sign the death warrant of someone by drone strike. And then once he's done that, the military has 60 days in which to kill this individual. If they don't kill them within those 60 days, they have to re-up the process again. And what we heard from people who work on drone operations is that if you haven't found your target and your 60-day window is about to close, there's a lot of pressure to take a shot, any shot, at bad guys, even if they're not the exact bad guys that President Obama has authorized for death. The CIA operates under much more lax conditions, and I think that's why you've seen very large-scale civilian deaths in these CIA strikes, particularly in Pakistan.
Tom, I believe that you can add to how these decisions are made, the intelligence behind it, and how they're justified.
Well, thank you, Jane. If I may, I just want to comment on a couple of, I think, slightly misleading comments there. And then, if I may, I'll say what I think the much wider issue is that underlies this topic, and I think it's really important that we have a very public debate about. So just a couple of misleading thoughts. I think it's misleading to call these operations assassinations. So an assassination is when you target a political leader, a scientist, someone who's not in uniform, not a combatant for political purposes. And the targeting of high-value targets in Afghanistan is very clearly not that. It's going after combatants who are in positions of leadership. And that's much more akin to, imagine a sniper trying to go after a battalion commander, for instance, in war. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. In fact, it's not just legitimate, it's morally the best thing to do, because if you take out that commander, you're going to lead to fewer casualties overall. And it's really important to say enemy lives matter as well.
And who determines that person is a combatant commander?
Right, great. So this is where social context becomes really clear. And if I may, can I just postpone that till we get to the wider issue, which I think is the really underlying one. The second comment is, we live in a non-ideal world. We always have less than ideal intelligence. The courts always have less than ideal intelligence. The courts convict on beyond reasonable doubt. And in wartime, I'm afraid that criterion gets lessened. So long as we have sufficient evidence, good evidence, that people are involved in combat, then that seems to me to be the best that we can work with. And military necessity means we need to act in that situation.
How do you define good evidence?
I'm sure Jeremy will disagree,
but none of these people are being indicted. No evidence is being presented against them. You're relying on a secret process with no independent accountability and just saying that some targeter somewhere is judge, jury, and executioner. That doesn't sound like a moral high ground position that the U.S. or Britain are taking in the world.
Can I just bring in Nadim Houry
great.
here?
So this is,
sorry, what is human rights'
viewpoint?
Issue, Tom, we will come back to you. I mean, what is human rights' viewpoint here when it comes to deciding who is a legitimate target?
International law is very clear. I mean, we have laws of war that have been around for a long time. So I think we need to distinguish two types of situation. There are situations where there is an active armed conflict going on. You know, if you think about Yemen today, many parts of Yemen today, not all of it, Syria, Iraq. And if you would say, okay, the U.S. is at war with ISIS, so the U.S. could target, you know, an ISIS commander, an ISIS unit. They would be a legitimate military target, though the U.S. would still have the obligation to, one, make sure that they're targeting a military objective, and two, take all measures to minimize any potential civilian harm, the proportionality test. But then you have something more dangerous, particularly when it comes to the drones, which is strikes that are taking place outside of an active war zone, you know, and this is where we can get into that for a long, long time. But this idea that somehow you can apply the laws of war even if you don't actually have an active conflict in that specific area. And I think that's very dangerous, because then you're saying anyone is a legitimate target and I can target them. But the international legal framework says no. If you are talking about Pakistan, for example, the US is not at war with Pakistan, so you can't do a sort of kill operation and just say, you know, you pick and choose the laws that you want to apply. If you can actually catch that person, you have to go and try to capture them. You know, it's not what we think, it's what the law, and the law has been very clear. And I think the key here is, with the Human Rights Watch has been calling for an independent probe of these drone attacks, and actually of other strikes that kill civilians, for a long, long time. There's a deep need for transparency here. As Jeremy mentioned, we know very little about the CIA program that has killed thousands of people in Pakistan. We need to be able to assess that, and we can't take the word of the authorities on it. I mean, I think one of the revelations in the documents, the source that I think Jeremy spoke to, basically indicated that the US considers anyone killed in these drone strikes as sort of the default position as an enemy killed in action, even if they don't have, this is the sort of presumption, unless the onus is to show that they were actually civilians. This is actually, you know, putting international law on its head, because international laws of war specifically say that, you know, you are a civilian as a default position unless there's an indication that you are a combatant. Does this restrict the ability of armed forces to conduct operations? Yes. Is this a good restriction? Yes, because this is the only way that we can ensure a form of accountability and that we can insist on the importance of protecting civilians.
Okay, Nadim, let's flesh out that quote a little bit more, because it was in 2013 that the US first publicly acknowledged its drone strike program. President Obama defended it by saying, America doesn't take strikes to punish individuals. We act against terrorists who pose a continuing and most imminent threat to the American people, before adding, and before any strike is taken, there must be near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured, the highest standards we can set. Tom, clearly none of that is true.
Great, yeah, and so just to echo what Nadim said, it's really important that near certainty criterion is not just enacted in practice, and we have good evidence that it's not been, but that there's transparency that it has been enacted in going forward. But if I may just disagree with the presumption that's been behind both what Jeremy and Nadim have just said, there's a much deeper issue here that we've inherited, and our law embodies a very clear distinction between war and peace, and we have separate laws governing war, the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, which govern times of war, and then we have separate legal conventions, domestic law, which govern times of peace. The point in history that we're at is that it's not obvious that the practices of force in those two contexts are sufficient to give adequate security. And just a bit of history is really important here. So right in the back of all of our minds is the Iraq intervention in the 2000s, and that's clearly been a disaster. But there's another disaster that happened in the 1990s, which was not intervening in Afghanistan when al-Qaeda was incubated under the Taliban's rule, and that led to 9/11 and indeed the generation, the decade of conflict that we've got across the Middle East. So big intervention is looking increasingly bad, and no intervention is also not very helpful. And what governments are trying to do right now, they're sort of feeling their way, is they're trying to find some kind of middle ground by which they can intervene to stop these transnational actors carrying out their political aims internationally and ensure adequate security. And I'm not saying that the current resolution is the right one for that, but I am saying that's an issue that needs to be confronted. And the really hard question is, if we do take the moral high ground and say, look, we only go in for declared wars under extremely restricted circumstances, and every other time we use the normal police conventions, the result of that, there's no question about it, the result of that is that more innocent civilians will die at the hands of terrorist outrages.
OK,
so
and sorry, let me pick up on that point if I may, because sorry, Tom, I do want to just push it on a bit here and throw this to you, Jeremy. The more innocent people who die, I mean, surely that's creating a bigger problem for those who are related to them, for those in the community, because they in turn could then turn against the Americas, the Britons, those who are dropping the bombs, the drones on them.
And it's not just people like me that are saying that. I mean, I've spent considerable time on the ground in Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere around the world. Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who was the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and was one of the top people in the Joint Special Operations Command when they were killing their way through high-value individuals in Iraq, said that when you kill someone in a drone strike, he said, when you kill Abu Bag of Donuts in a drone strike and you feel good about yourself for 24 hours and you put out a headline that we killed this guy, you've made a martyr of him and you've given his surviving comrades more of an agenda to fight. But to me, and I would love to hear Tom's response to this, to me the entire underpinning of Obama's claim that we don't, that we're careful, that we minimize civilian, deaths, it's all put to lie when you look at the fact that under this administration, they have conducted so-called signature strikes, where they are killing people whose identities they don't know based on patterns in their metadata, who they're talking to, where they are geographically, and the fact that they're military-aged males. That is just a flagrant contradiction to the claim that there's any kind of care taken in these strikes when you decide that people in the middle of Nowheresville, Yemen, should be killed because they're military-aged males whose SIM cards have been in touch with certain individuals. That's pre-crime territory. That's Minority Report without Tom
Tom,
Cruise.
do you want to jump in quickly?
Yeah, I'm not at all supportive of signature strikes. The objections that are made seem to me to be very strong ones. I would distinguish between the specifics of how aspects of the drone program are conducted and the legitimacy in some circumstances of some drone strikes, and we should be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Nadim, when you look at what's happening at the moment, how many foreign fighters are going over to Iraq and Syria and returning back to whether it's the UK or France, the increase in drone strikes, it doesn't look like this is going to end any time soon, does it? These justified killings, whatever you end up calling them.
No, it isn't. And I think actually today it's timely we're having this conversation. The US and Russia signed a memorandum of understanding, in a way deciding how they're going to split the skies over Syria. But what was missing, they haven't made that memorandum public, but while they're worried about the safety of their own pilots and any sort of accident between planes, there was nothing about how to protect civilians on the ground, for example, in Syria. And I think this is what's been missing in a lot of these debates. The problem is when you put the terrorism label, and I don't want to minimize that there is a security threat, but when you put the terrorism label, you actually stop the conversation. It all just becomes about, well, how are we going to kill them? And there is no substantive discussion about, well, what are you doing to protect civilians? How are you making sure that when you hit someone in Raqqa or you hit a target in Raqqa, you are taking all feasible precautions not to kill civilians? And this is because this is what we're documenting. We're documenting that in a number of strikes that have been done by the US and the coalition close to it, and also by Russia, which has also been bombing now in Syria, many of the casualties are civilians. Now, not all strikes that kill civilians are necessarily illegal, but when you have a strike that kills civilians, it's the beginning of it, you need an investigation. And when you ask for those investigations, be it from the US or now from Russia, the answer is, well, we don't think we're killing any civilians. But they don't explain to you what investigation they have done. Okay. It's very difficult today for journalists or human rights workers to do these investigations because these are ISIS-controlled areas. And so you're left in a protection gap. And frankly, we cannot take the assurances from these countries to the bank to say, okay, we feel confident that civilians are not being killed.
Okay, and let's leave it there. Big topic indeed, but thank you very much for talking us through it. Jeremy Scahill, Nadim Houry and Tom Simpson. And thank you very much for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme's page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can also post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story or at Jane Dutton. And from me, Jane Dutton, the rest of the team, thank you very much for watching.